Hi, I'm Graham. I drive trucks, I write books, and I draw pictures. You've got a lot more time on your hands. Maybe you've even got kids that have a lot more time at home right now, and they're probably going stir crazy being stuck at the house. Why don't you let me read them a story? Like this story, Engines of Liberty, Rebel Heart. This was my debut novel in 2014. It just turned 6 years old this month. It's set in an alternate history where the British won the American Revolution because they had magic. But 200 years later, the American rebels have built up a massive mechanized arsenal and they are ready for a rematch. All they need are soldiers and operators to take these machines into war against the magicians. Their newest recruit is Calvin Adler, but he might be a little bit more than they bargained for. We'll find that out over the course of the series. Took me 3 years to put this whole thing together. It was a lot of fun to do, and now I want to share it with you. I will read a chapter every weekday, and I'll post it right here on this channel. So make sure you subscribe. Stay subscribed, maybe even hit the bell for notifications so you can see when every chapter goes live. If you have any questions about this or other series and books that I've been working on for the last 6 years, leave me a question in the comments and we'll get to it. Thanks, you guys. This is an interesting time, to say the least. But our ancestors have faced even more interesting times, and they made it because, clearly, we are here. And we'll make it too, as long as we dig in and pull together. So this is one of my ideas to just try to make the time go a little bit easier for all of us. Anyway, without further ado, here is Chapter 1 of Rebel Heart. There are illustrations in this book, and I'll show them as they go. I open this with a quote and a dedication. The dedication is for Shara, my wife, who let me narrate some pretty bad writing during our courtship, and she still decided to marry me. The time is now near at hand, which must probably determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves, whether their houses and farms are to be pillaged and destroyed, and themselves consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will deliver them. General George Washington, 26 August, 1776. I start this chapter with an illustration of Calvin Adler. You'll quickly find out what his profession is, why he's dressed that way, and why he's got a pair of shears in his hand. Chapter 1. Summer waned, but the late afternoon heat still slickened Calvin's forehead with gritty sweat. The pile of freshly sheared wool before him resisted his attempts to clean it, and a dull ache had built up in his back. His hands were numb, waterlogged from working all day, and yet the load never seemed to shrink. He cast a glance over his shoulder at the barn, where mother and father enjoyed the shade as they sheared even more wool off the flock. Calvin sighed and hung his head. Last year he had built a machine to speed things up, a sort of gin that would soak, scrub, and work the wool until most of the oil and dirt were out of it, all with the crank of a single handle. But shortly after he'd gotten it working, the local mages had come by and cursed it with their wands. The contraption fell to pieces on the spot, its component parts refusing to connect ever again. The mages laughed as they walked away, indifferent to Calvin's plight. When Father returned home later that day, Calvin complained about what they'd done. As usual, Father only capitulated to what the mages wanted. "You're lucky they didn't fine us. You shouldn't build things, Cal," he'd said in hushed tones. "Why not?" "Machines require special permits. There's a lot of paperwork, and it's expensive." "But why? It doesn't have to be." "They're just dangerous. You understand?" "No." Father threw his hands up. "Look, things are a certain way for a reason. We can do it by hand without causing any trouble, so that's how you'll do it. No more questions." Every time Calvin asked why things had to be this way, that was usually the answer. He resumed his work, wringing out a clump of wool and setting it in the clean pile to be dried. This year's yield was higher than last year's, and the Adlers were sure to fetch a higher price per measure. The material was always in demand because the mages preferred it for their flying carpets and traveling cloaks. Even if that fact drove the price up, Calvin didn't get why his family sold their wares to the mages. The lousy Brits always found a way to cut the final price by half. That rankled Calvin further. It meant he was working twice as hard as he had to for what they'd get paid. Criminal. That's what it was. But when you didn't have magic, how did you stand up to someone who did? Mother and father were thrilled at what higher sales meant for their prospects. They could perhaps pay off the flock and build their savings. Calvin didn't bother telling them that they'd have been done 2 seasons ago if they'd just used some real equipment. His complaints would only fall on deaf ears. Scraping handfuls of wet, dirty wool against a washboard, Calvin longed for his machine and seethed at the mages who had destroyed it. The echoes of their laughter still taunted him. Permits, he spat. Using a thin rag wrapped around the back of his wrist, Calvin wiped his brow for the 1,000th time. It was thoroughly soaked from the day's effort, and now wholly ineffectual. He stood up and rested his back for a minute, craning his neck to survey the town in all its simple glory. Log cabins and ramshackle farmhouses spotted the landscape. Thin wisps of smoke trailed up from cooking fires as housewives got supper underway. The people toiled, content for the most part, engulfed in their work. Overhead, a conspiracy of ravens swam lazily into the trees. Calvin envied them, envied their power to spread their wings and just leave a place if they didn't like it. Nobody held them back, made them stay in the same spot, scrubbing dirty old sheep fibers until their fingernails stung, smiling the whole time like they enjoyed what they did. Down the main road, a trio of mages rounded the corner, their long red cloaks swaying behind them. Calvin froze, his eyes narrowing almost by reflex. The 2 older mages in front, Winston Fitznottingham and Hammond Birtwistle, had been tormenting the residents of Baltimore for most of his life. Calvin didn't know the 3rd mage, who didn't look a day over 14 years old, yet still wore the robes of a full officer. He walked behind the others with a profound kind of sulk that Calvin saw whenever he looked in the mirror, even when he was trying to hide it. I've got this scene illustrated. There's Calvin, and there's the 3 mages in the background. Fun note about that, for Fitznottingham, and Birtwistle, I used James A. Owen and J. Scott Savage as the models, and then the younger mage, who we'll find later, we'll get some details on him. The model for him was my brother-in-law, Joseph. What bloody reason did a mage have to sulk? Fitznottingham and Birtwistle were showing the new guy around town. The 2 elder mages drank their usual pungent ale from porcelain flagons, and when they drained the last of their cups, they used their wands to transfigure them into coins. These they placed in their pockets, careful to make sure a handful of the villagers were watching. In particular, a young girl with pigtails staring up at them in wide-eyed wonder, despite her parents' pleas to keep walking. "Bet that'd be nice to do, yeah?" Fitznottingham sneered at the girl, flipping the coin over in his hands. She nodded, eyes bright. Calvin saw fear on her father's face, even at this distance. "Well, keep dreaming," Fitz snapped. He flicked his wand at the girl's bare feet. Vines snaked up out of the ground and wrapped tightly around her ankles, holding her in place. The girl's eyes went from wonder to horror, and an awful shriek escaped her throat as she kicked against the top vines. Her mother begged her to be quiet and hold still so her father could work the vines off of her thrashing feet, but the girl would not endure reason. Still, the spell was ultimately harmless, if a little damaging to the girl's confidence. Fitz and Bertie strolled onward, chortling at their own wit. Oh, what Calvin would do to them if he could get away with it. Sometimes he felt like people were right at the edge of their tolerance, and all they needed was the right push to fight back. It wasn't completely unheard of. He'd seen it happen only once, a long time ago, in Boston. Calvin recalled the trip he'd taken with his father. They'd left Baltimore and led a horse-drawn wagon all the way up to Massachusetts, where father knew of a captain who would deliver their wool to a wholesaler in Nouveau-France for a small commission. Their meager stock from that season had filled only a small part of the deck on the captain's ship. The rest of it was dried tea leaves in strong crates secured with a special kind of iron. "Frosted iron," the captain whispered to father, "so as it can't be magicked away by the mages, you see. It's a special product from Ohio. Your load's safe on this ship, Mr. Adler." Father was impressed. "And all this tea?" The captain told how he and a handful of his friends had planted the valuable crop many years prior, tended to it themselves, harvested the leaves and dried them with painstaking care. It would catch a king's ransom on the open market compared to what the crew normally sold on their voyages. Father and the captain shook hands and parted ways. Yet it would seem that not all of the captain's commercial associates had been so discreet that year. After Calvin and Father had gotten off the ship, a trio of mages showed up, wands in hand and matching sneers on their faces. At the time, Calvin hadn't understood what was happening. The mages demanded to know the captain's intent for the tea. He and his crew bristled at the question. Some of them quietly grabbed nearby instruments off the deck, but they weren't holding them the way they held tools. The captain stated his business, that they meant to sell their haul, and the mage casually said he'd have to confiscate the load. "It just wouldn't be fair to the other colonists who don't have any tea to sell," the mage had said, signaling for his companions to seize every crate of product. Calvin scratched his head at this. If the captain and his men had done all the work, why shouldn't they sell it? Apparently, the captain agreed with this sentiment. What happened next was burned into Calvin's memory, sure as a branding iron marked livestock. Some of the crewmen were still loading crates of tea leaves onto the deck of the boat. Half a dozen crates sat on a platform mounted to the dock, all rigged up with ropes and pulleys so it could swing out over the water. While the platform hung between the dock and the boat, the captain uttered a word in what sounded like an Indian language. One of the crew members, a bronze-skinned man with pitch-black hair shaved in an extreme pattern, drew a tomahawk from behind his belt, spun around, and hurled it with stunning accuracy at the rigging. The tomahawk's blade bit into the ropes, sliced them clean through, and unlaced the complicated weave that allowed the platform to move. 6 crates plunged into the salty water below, instantly ruined. To save the falling crates, the mages uttered summoning spells in the old Saxon tongue, but the anti-magical iron did its job. Calvin was pretty sure a fight had broken out after that, but he didn't get to see it. Father clapped a hand over Calvin's eyes and quickly whisked him away, telling him they were to return to Baltimore immediately. Even now, Father refused to let Calvin speak of that day, and all of his questions since then had been met with a sharp command to put it out of his mind. Calvin had never forgotten it, though. After years of seeing Fitz and Bertie squeeze coins out of the Baltimore residents, Calvin eventually understood why the captain had destroyed his load. If he couldn't keep what was his, the mages, sure as daylight, weren't going to get it. He kept that in mind as Fitznottingham, Birtwistle, and their new charge rolled up to the Tanner house across the way, eyeing the wares in the front yard. Mr. and Mrs. Tanner were metalsmiths by trade, and they guaranteed every tool they sold. For anyone else, it would have been a risky business model, but Calvin knew the Tanners to be good people who made good instruments. At the moment, there were 3 other men in the yard, talking with Mr. Tanner next to a row of newly made shovels. "Right then, Tanner," said Birtwistle, his British accent even more annoying through his drunken slur. "It's that time of the week again." Mr. Tanner went pale. His 3 guests exchanged a glance, then looked back and forth between Mr. Tanner and the mages. "But, Mr. Birtwistle, it's only been 5 days, and," Mr. Tanner began. "They always get like this," Fitznottingham muttered to the new guy. "Trick is, you don't give 'em an inch. Watch old Bertie here. He knows what's what." "It's been 2 days since the weekend, Tanner. That means it's a new week. Cough 'em up then, we ain't got all day." Birtwistle made a show of rubbing his thumb against his index finger. In his other hand, he held his wand at his side. Calvin's knuckles turned white around the wool in his hand. He could see it play out in his head now. Birtwistle would go about collecting like this 2 or 3 more times over the next couple of months, then make it the norm. Soon he'd be collecting twice a week, then thrice, then daily, and not just from Tanner. Everyone on the street would pay that way. Sure, the daily amount would be lower than the monthly amount, but not when you added it all up. Calvin would protest to Father. Father wouldn't listen. Mother would go along with Father. Things would either stay the same or get worse. That was how it always went. Calvin hated how everyone just let it happen. Tanner blanched and fumbled for an excuse while his customers backed away. Mrs. Tanner appeared in the doorway, face equally aghast. She muttered something to her husband about not having enough money yet from this week's business. Birtwistle clicked his tongue in disapproval, and the tip of his wand flicked nervously like it was anxious to cast a spell. Calvin found himself moving before he could give it a second thought. Mother and father weren't right there to stop him, so he dropped the wool. In one hand he grabbed the handle of the sluice bucket, and with the other he snatched up a wooden rake that had been leaning against the wash bin. Hoisting the sluice bucket onto one shoulder, Calvin crossed the road in half a dozen steps and, holding his breath against the rapid-fire beat of his heart, called out to Mr. Tanner. "Mr. Tanner, you still need me to water your grass?" Fitznottingham flinched, not having heard Calvin approach from behind. The man's eyes were red and watery, refusing to focus the way a sober person's would. He was the perfect distance away. Calvin pretended to trip. The bucket of disgusting water launched into the air and drenched Fitznottingham from head to waist, marring his fine robes with the grit and grease of several dozen sheep's worth of wool. "You pikey little pillock!" Fitz shrieked. "Oh, no! I'm sorry, Mr. Fitznottingham," Calvin exclaimed. He'd hung the rake over his shoulder when he'd tripped. Gripping it tight, he spun around to face Fitz, allowing the end of the rake to catch a surprised Birtwistle hard on the cheek. The latter staggered back a step and immediately cupped a hand to his face. If they hadn't been drunk, Calvin wouldn't have gotten within 10 steps of them. The third mage, the new one, jumped back wordlessly and avoided the whole mess. As Bertie nursed his cheek, Fitz swore and lazily waved his wand, vanishing the water out of his clothing. He rose to his full height and leered down at Calvin. "What then? The nerve of you, duffer trash!" Calvin glared at the mage, rooted in place by a flaming batch of courage and a tiny garnish of fear. Had he really just done that? "I'm mighty sorry, Mr. Fitznottingham. I keep my head low when you're about, as I should, and on account of paying my respects, I didn't quite keen to your proximity." He rubbed a fair amount of his duffer accent on the words to sell the act. "Why, I never!" Fitz spat out a disgusting stream of blackened spittle. Some of the water had gotten in his mouth then. "That was intentional!" Mrs. Tanner looked dumbfounded, standing there in slack-jawed disbelief. Her 3 customers fixed Calvin with nearly identical looks of curiosity, but said nothing. It was Mr. Tanner who ran to Calvin's aid. "Oh, no, Mr. Fitznottingham, I saw the whole thing. The Adler boy dumps his bucket in our yard to water the grass for us. He tripped. Don't be angry with him. It was an accident." Fitz only spared Mr. Tanner the briefest of glances before jabbing Calvin in the ribs with his wand. "Accident or not, you're not paying proper heed to your betters." Calvin fought to keep his eyes from narrowing, fought to hold back the rage that boiled up inside him. As much as he wanted to tell Fitz to kindly go throw himself off a bridge, he held his tongue. If nothing else, Mr. Tanner had just put himself at great risk for Calvin. He wavered, mind racing for a way to shield the man from his actions. "Again, terribly sorry, sir," Calvin managed. "Mr. Tanner's right, of course, about the grass and all. I was being clumsy and dropped it on you. And poor Mr. Birtwistle, well, he's got a good strong jaw and such. Really, it's the rake that got the worst end of the exchange." At the sound of his name, Bertie grunted and clambered to his feet. "Do you think I'm stupid, you munter?" "I'd really love to answer that question." "Never, my lord. You're a mage, after all. The rest of us is just duffers, you see. Myself, and the Tanners, and their 3 guests, and my parents across the road, and then there's the Perry family next door, and Mr. Perry wrestles down at the pub twice a week for prize money. He's on a win streak going 2 months if it's a week. Let's see, there's also the Martins, who push their hand carts all the livelong day, moving wares for us simple folk, and blast me if those carts don't get heavy around high noon, but those Martin boys just keep pushing. Of course, that's all we duffers do, is push and pull and lift and work with our hands while the sun's up, on account of we got no magic. Builds the body, I guess. If we had minds half as built as our shoulders, why, we wouldn't need you, fine lords, now would we? Calvin bit his lip for added effect. So no, my Lord Birtwistle, I'd never think you were stupid. Not a finer mage in Baltimore. Except you, Lord Fitz. Call it even, then. Birtwhistle's eyes flitted around the open street as Calvin spoke, and something clicked in the back of his plastered brain. They were surrounded. The Perrys and the Martins and everyone who had lived on their street had come out to see what the fuss was all about. And whether they intended to do anything or not, Bertie could still do the math. Even with magic, their skills were outmatched. Now it was on them to decide whether punishing Calvin for an accident was worth the fallout. There goes your balance, Calvin thought. Oh, I see what you're about, then, Bertie whispered, his eyes stealing for a moment through the ale in his blood. Clever one. I've been accused of worse things than wit, my lord. Calvin had to fight every muscle in his face not to grin. Bertie's wand snapped into his hand. For the briefest fraction of a second, Calvin thought he was done for, that the mage might just be gutsy enough to mow down an entire neighborhood, and that it would be all his fault. But then Bertie trained the wand on Calvin's empty bucket that lay in the road. Hail von Fear! He muttered the magical curse with exceptional relish. The bucket split into pieces, which then hovered and spun in a tight circle, glowing like hot embers in a fire. The pieces rose up a few feet off the ground and blasted out in every direction. Parts of Mr. Tanner's yard caught fire, as did Calvin's and the Perrys. A sheep bleated as far away as the Adler's barn, a cry of pain, no doubt. Birtwistle cocked a half smile, impressed with his work. Clumsy me, he sneered. For added measure, Fitznottingham thrust his wand at the pile of wool in Calvin's yard and uttered a second spell. For Milton! The already washed wool transfigured into a bubbling puddle of polluted tar, which pierced the evening air with a sharp stink. I do declare, it's just not our day, is it, Hammond? Fitz asked his friend. I swear I can't aim this thing to save me life. He cackled at his own joke, nudging the mage in training with his elbow. The trainee regarded them all sourly, like he was too good to be wasting his time with any of this. A shrill cry filled the air, a cry Calvin knew all too well. It came from his family's barn, in his father's voice. Calvin! What the... Oh, Mr. Fitznottingham! There at the front door appeared Father, his clothes soiled from the day's labor. Mother came up behind him and took stock of the situation. Father rushed out into the street to fawn over Fitz's still grimy robes. The water spell hadn't removed all of the grit. Your idiot son dumped a bucket of filthy water on me, Fitz said. I am so sorry, sir. We'll... Wash it all by hand, suggested the bored apprentice, folding his arms. Of course, Father agreed, and we can... Save it, you nit, Birtwistle growled. He twirled his wand, muttered another spell, and removed the last of the water and oil from his friend's robes, good as new. You forget who you're on with? That was a complicated bit of magic I just had to do, on account of your son. You reckon that ought to be free, then? Surely not, Mother began. Fitznottingham cut her off. Good. Glad that's settled. He struck out with his wand one more time and made a broad, sweeping gesture at the Adler's land, muttering Saxon words under his breath. The very ground glowed with a dull, pulsing light, and for a brief moment Calvin feared that Fitz might burn their farm. Before a cry could escape his lips, the light pooled under a corner of the house foundation, and then faded. With an evil grin, Fitz trained his wand at the window at the corner of the house, Mother and Father's bedroom. Penning Fleon, he said. A sharp crack of splitting wood echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable clang of crunched metal that could only be the family's strongbox. Glass shattered as several pounds of gold crowns sprayed through the window, crushing it beyond all hope of repair. The coins slowed and drifted into the folds of Fitznottingham's robes. From the look of it, Calvin guessed it to be most of what his family had saved for the past year. Father gasped. Mother let out a muted whimper and raised a hand to her mouth. Got an illustration here of Calvin's parents. "There, we'll call that settled for this month," Birtwistle sneered. "Right then, Fitz, Godfrey, this way. I think we've worked hard enough for one day." As the mages retreated from the stone-silent street, pretending to be about a leisurely stroll, Calvin felt the heat of many eyes glaring at him, and not just from his parents. The Tanners, the Perrys, and everyone else stared at him as if he'd just set fire to the general store. Father cuffed him on the ear. "What the hell were you thinking, boy?" "William, don't. Not in the street," Mother pleaded. "Quiet, Becca." To Calvin, he said, "That was our share to repay the franchiser. It's due in a month, and now we've got nothing. They'll repossess the flock when we can't pay." "How is that my fault? I've been sweating and bleeding into this mess just as much as you have," Calvin shot back. "And now it's gone," Father shouted. "Why are you yelling at me? They're the ones who took it," Calvin shouted back, pointing down the street at the mages, who might not have been out of earshot. Father snatched Calvin's ear and twisted it, dragging him back to the house. Mother was right on their heels. Calvin grimaced all the way back into the house, where Father threw him inside and barred the door behind Mother. "Damn it all, Calvin! You've ruined everything! I told you not to cause problems, that there would be consequences. Now look at us! We'll never get that money back in time," Father said, tears forming in his eyes. "Bet you we could if we used my gin," Calvin retorted. "You could have paid the franchiser a long time ago." "I hope you're happy, son. I hope your nerve keeps you warm the next month when we're living in the woods and we're out of food. There you can build all the machines you want. You damn fool boy." Father trailed off and hunched over, his shoulders trembling as he sobbed, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. "Ruined. And we were so close." Mother moved to Father's side to comfort him, not even looking in Calvin's direction. Calvin pursed his lips. He couldn't find it within himself to say anything more. It wasn't like his parents would listen. He retreated to his room. He didn't doubt that he'd done a good thing, standing up to the mages in front of everyone else, and yet he hated seeing his parents in pain like that. Yes, they were broke. No, it wasn't his fault. Every day, he hated the mages a little more. This is not the end of the chapter. I'm just trying to keep the pipes lubricated with this quality Headless Horseman mug. Available for a very brief time at inktail.com, but they are going out of business on April 4th, so join the club if you can. Good stuff. This is where we have a little bit of an asterisk demonstrating a paragraph break, because we're going to have a slight change in perspective here for a moment. Godfrey Norrington had remained as quiet as a mouse during the entire exchange between Fitznottingham, Birtwistle, and the young colonial duffer. The boy had very obviously attacked them on purpose, though he hid his intent with admirable skill. If there was one emotion Godfrey could detect without trying, it was anger. As a full mage, he had a wide variety of magical aptitudes. Mancers were usually limited to just one skill, controlling an element or communicating with animals or some such. Mages, on the other hand, could always explore and enhance their natural talents. Godfrey had learned even before his 10th birthday that he could detect what he called the red emotions. Lust, for example, was easily visible and perhaps the most common. Jealousy was another, though people seemed to think it was green for some foolish reason. But nothing was ever more obvious than unbridled rage. And that duffer brat, whoever he was, had been beet red on the emotional spectrum when Godfrey first took notice of him. The sight of it gave him such a shock that he could only stare and watch the youth carry out his assault. Godfrey had never come across such a brazen duffer. Watching him explode on Fitz and Bertie had given him the faintest taste of amusement. Ever since Godfrey had been banished to the Maryland colony, he'd been starved for entertainment. So he'd let Bertie and Fitz throw their tantrums and rob that family blind rather than execute the boy right there on the spot. Maybe if they hadn't been so smashed, they'd have seen the truth for themselves. Then again, not many mages cared to develop their emotolectural prowess. And that was fine with Godfrey. When it came to reading emotions, he liked being the best. He glanced over his shoulder as they walked away and watched the boy's father drag him back to the house. Godfrey thought of his own father far across the ocean in England, and for the briefest whisper of a moment, he felt for the young duffer. "My father's a complete prat as well," he imagined himself saying to the boy. Then he squashed that thought. One didn't waste time making friends with duffers. He might as well befriend a diseased dog. Sighing to himself, Godfrey kept his hands clasped behind his back and brought up the rear behind Fitz and Bertie as they marched back to the dormitory where they lived. Godfrey had his own machinations upon which to dwell, namely, how to get off this wretched continent and get back to England. Godfrey Norrington was meant for greater things than this, no matter what his git father had to say about it. Another beverage break because of another paragraph break. Around midnight, Calvin awoke to a tapping sound against his bedroom window. Pushing himself up on the sawdust mattress, he groaned at the soreness in his body and sat upright to see what the ruckus was. He bumped into someone in the dark and froze. A cry formed in his throat, but it died on his lips, smothered by a gloved hand. Two more unseen hands pinned his arms to his sides. His body flooded with strength born of sudden panic. Calvin thrashed and tried to pull free, but the intruders had been ready for this, and they held fast. "Hush now, Calvin Adler. We're not mages, and we're on your side," whispered a voice beside his ear. Against the dimly lit window, he saw the silhouette of a third figure pulling the window closed. That was the tapping sound he'd heard. Strangers entering his house. "I am going to release you now. If you make any noise, if you call to your parents, we will subdue you with greater force. You will not enjoy it," the voice warned. "Understood?" Breathing in short bursts through his nose, Calvin mumbled his consent. The glove pulled away from his mouth. He tugged free and staggered back, wishing desperately for a light, and even more so for a weapon. His first wish was granted. The man who'd spoken lit a candle, throwing up a circus of flickering shadows around the small room. Calvin narrowed his eyes. "Hey, you were in the tanner's yard!" Immediately the hand covered his mouth again. "Too loud. Be quieter. Last warning," the man said. Eyes wide, Calvin nodded, and the man relaxed, the candlelight flickering against the hard features of his face. His comrades flanked him, and Calvin got a good look at their faces. They were of a large build and grizzled in appearance, what with their traveling coats, their high boots, and all manner of gear about them. The leader, that was how Calvin perceived him, had a 3-day beard and dark hair that hung in his eyes. The man on his left had sandy blonde hair that curled, and the third man bore a prominent mustache that almost covered his lip. Calvin took a deep breath and lowered his voice. "What are you doing in my house?" he demanded. "Won't be yours for much longer, the way I hear it. Unless, of course, someone were to return these." The leader dropped a small canvas bag at Calvin's feet. It thudded heavily against the floorboards. Whatever was inside, it clinked like metal. Calvin's heart beat a little bit faster. "No way." "Gold crowns, every last one of them." "Who are you?" Calvin asked. "My name is John Penn. These are my associates, Griff Cade and Daniel Aberforth. We are, well, equalizers of a sort," John said. "Some people need jobs done, and we bring in the tools to do them." He nudged the bag of coins with the toe of one boot. "These are the men right here." "You lifted this off of Fitz and Bertie?" "Yeah, it was fun," said Daniel, the curly-haired man. "No way," Calvin whispered. "How? They're mages." "And we're technomancers," said John. Calvin fixed the man with a blank stare. "Say again?" "Technomancers. echoed the one called Griff. You're magicians, then? They laughed quietly. No, John said. It's science, not magic. Whereas pyromancers use fire, or somnomancers manipulate dreams, technomancers use technology. When John figured that Calvin didn't know that last word, he explained further. Machines, instruments, things that can level the playing field against magic. He produced a printed square of paper from his breast pocket and handed it over. Calvin held it up to the light. There was a drawing on the face of it, depicting a man in sturdy clothing, brandishing weapons at a man opposite him. This second figure was clearly a British mage, who held up his hands in an act of pleading. The inscription around the drawing read, "You can do any job with the right tool." Nice little piece of wartime propaganda right there. By the crown, Calvin breathed. You're rebels. The mustachioed man chuckled. If only that began to cover it, kid. But you can fight mages. All the time. Fight 'em, kill 'em, whatever it takes. Calvin studied the drawing. The man on the left, a technomancer, brandished a knife and something else, something Calvin had seen only in drawings, something that had been forbidden since time immemorial. A handgun. No way. No way. You guys don't have guns. Nobody does. The words hadn't even made it all the way out of his mouth before each man's hand was at his hip, digging in a leather holster and snapping a pistol out for proof. Calvin gasped. He reached out to touch John's gun, but John drew it back and replaced it in his holster, his fingers easily accustomed to holding and twirling the thing. This isn't a social call. We came to this town in search of new cadets. Mr. Tanner's skill as a metalsmith caught my eye, but somehow I don't think he has the temperament to do what we do. You, on the other hand, what are you, about 15? Yes, this summer past, Calvin answered automatically, eyes still fixed on the men's guns. Real guns? Good. You're older than a lot of kids we've had in the past, said John. You want to learn how to shoot a gun? He couldn't believe his ears. You serious? Dead serious. And guns are only the simplest of our machines. You know how the mages have monsters that they control with magic? Well, we have monstrosities of our own, made of metal and powered by engines. Tanner mentioned that you built a machine last year. It must have worked rather well for the mages to destroy it. It worked great, Calvin growled. Mechanical inclination will serve you well as a technomancer. There is no shortage of weapons and tools at our disposal, Calvin. What we need are good people to wield them. Our training camp is a few days away from here, and the director will accept new recruits for the next little while. John pointed a finger at Calvin, completing the thought. Calvin closed his eyes and rubbed the heels of his hands against them. Hang on. You want me to leave my home and train with guns so I can fight mages, right? Well, guns are better than sluice buckets, Daniel pointed out. Calvin looked past them at his bedroom door. Beyond it was the short hallway to his parents' room. Their floorboards were still torn up from the mage's summoning spell, and it would be months before they could afford to have Mr. Tanner fix the strongbox, unless they spent the coins at Calvin's feet. I can't do that. I've already caused my parents enough trouble. More trouble than the mages? John asked, arching one eyebrow. Calvin's heart beat a little faster. That's not it. I can't leave the farm. There's work. And workers here to do it. The farm will still be here in 6 weeks, especially now that your family's finances are secured. Fidgeting, he frowned at the recruiters. What's in 6 weeks? Daniel and Griff exchanged a hesitant look, but John never took his eyes off Calvin. In 6 weeks, there will be a massive organized attack against the mages' greatest weakness on this continent. They don't know what we know, that we know where to strike them, which gives us the advantage. Our disadvantage is that we're hindered by our lack of numbers. We have more weapons than warriors. If you really want to save your town, if you really want to be rid of Fitz and Birdie, then leave with us and become a technomancer. You'll have food, clothing, and your own equipment. In a matter of months, you and everyone you know and love could be free people. For that, the wool can run thin for a season. Don't you agree? John asked. Calvin grew quiet, succumbing to a kind of stillness that was altogether alien to him. How many times had he dreamed of having power over Fitznottingham and Birtwistle? Surely he'd wanted it when he'd picked up his bucket and crossed the road. Well, here was his chance at last. What was he so scared of? Abandoning mother and father? You can do any job with the right tool. What if I say no? Calvin asked flatly. John shrugged and let his hand fall to the gun at his hip. Well, I did just spill a very sensitive secret. We protect our secrets, Calvin. There's a reason why you haven't heard of us. Calvin glared at him. You're kidnapping me? That's not really giving me a choice. Perhaps not, but I doubt that in your heart of hearts you want to stay here and keep cleaning wool so the mages can have cheap carpets. Think ahead to the next time Fitz and Bertie come by to collect. How are you going to feel, knowing you could have done something to beat them? That Boston sailor appeared again in Calvin's memory, an everyday man who kept his hatchet-throwing skills a secret. Calvin thought of him hurling that tomahawk at the tea crane, sending months of his own hard labor into the sea with a single blow. He'd destroyed the results of so much work when he could no longer control it, when he wasn't living on his own terms. Deep down, Calvin knew he was in the same position. While the thought of running out on his folks made him a little sick inside, the allure of being more powerful than mages, of not having to play dumb around them, was too much temptation to resist. If he joined this army and they could somehow teach him to make the mages' gifts irrelevant, wouldn't that be better? How long does the training take? Calvin asked. 3, maybe 4 weeks, then you start to see action, said Daniel, brushing a curled lock of hair off his forehead. You show them you can work hard, maybe they'll even send you back to Baltimore when we strike. You can be part of the brigade that whips your local mages. John studied him with eyes that made Calvin feel like an open book. You have the hunger, kid. It's a hunger we all know. We've all lost property and loved ones to the mages too, and we each doubted we could make a difference. Do yourself a favor and make the choice. There's nothing left here for you if you keep going the way you have, the way your parents have, and the way all your ancestors have for centuries. Are you going to make a better life for yourself, or are you just going to roll over and take it like your old man? Calvin's neck bristled. He took a long, hard look at his shabby room, his forlorn bed, and the sack of gold coins at his feet. 3 weeks to train, 6 weeks to attack. A month and a half away from a lifetime of freedom. What was there to contemplate, really? He knew the answer. I'll do it. Thus concludes Chapter 1, one of the longer chapters in the book. Thanks for tagging along during these last 40 minutes. Check back in tomorrow for Chapter 2. Thanks for listening, guys. Drive safe. See you out there.